everybody. Let me welcome you. Oh, everybody is very happy to see one another, I know. My name is Marcia Friedman. I'm a member of Ashby Village since 2010, and since pretty much its beginning, and a member of the board and a member of the Arts and Culture group that has organized this event. I want to say that 2/3 of our organizing group are down with the flu, so I was kind of expecting to see half the seats empty. So I welcome you all and congratulations, you are not sick. Unlike so many people that I know, it's been quite extraordinary, really. It seems like there's a kind of epidemic, little mini epidemic in Berkeley itself, but at any rate, we are here. I especially want to welcome those of you who are new to Ashby Village, who are neither members nor volunteers. You've been given packets at the sign-in table. For those of you who know nothing about Ashby Village, we're an association of people over 50, some of us quite well over 50, as you can see, who have come together because we wish to remain in our own homes for as long as possible. We do that with an array of volunteer services, with the creation of an extraordinary community with numerous events that cover a very broad spectrum of activities and interests, as well as a kind of our own in-house Angie's List, and the opportunity to be part of something that is growing and developing, that is actually very innovative, and that we're still trying to figure out exactly how we make it work and who we are. So anybody who would like to get involved is more than welcome, either as a member or as a volunteer, if you aren't already. And I hope most of you are, actually, because it's well worth it. I just wanted to let you know that our guests are going to be speaking for about half an hour each, and then we will have a question and answer period. We have people who are going around and giving you cards and pencils. The questions will be written. They'll be brought up to the front, and we'll ask the questions from here. We're doing that because we found that it's very hard to hear people in the audience, and tend to run around with microphones to get to you in time is very time-consuming. So you get to have more questions this way, and they're actually questions. I want to thank all of the volunteers who managed to get here today, who remained healthy. Joanne Carter, who is in the front row, Joan Cole, Christina Holland, who is, I don't know where she is. Let me look at all these names so I don't forget anybody. Sigrid Duisberg, Dagmar Friedman, and Helen Berg. Thank you very, very much for coming out and for doing this. We find in the village that we have a lot of volunteers for a lot of different activities, because really volunteering, whether you're a member or a non-member, volunteering is really one of the most important and probably rewarding ways of being involved in the village. It's how you really get to know people. And when the chips are down and you need help in the village, the more people you know, the better it is. So I encourage any of you to think about volunteering, whether you're a member or not a member of the... I want to let you know there are books for sale in the hall, and our authors will be signing them if you like. We will have time after the presentation for the buying and selling of books. The other thing that I've been asked to tell you is that our speakers are both just getting over the flu and are therefore subject to a certain amount of coughing, especially when they're speaking. So please be aware that that may happen, and be patient while it's happening, and we will just proceed, and hopefully without coughs, but you just never know. And now let me introduce these wonderful women. These two women have been friends of one another for the past 30 years, and they have been friends of mine for the past 35 years. So we have long-standing close relationships between us, and we're very proud of them, and we cherish them very, very much. They managed to get through a process of 5 years of writing this book together and still remain friends, which I don't think was easy for anybody. But I also know that as their friend, that the friendship was paramount and writing the book was secondary, so that if it was going to get in the way of the friendship, you wouldn't have seen a book. The fact that there is a book and a friendship, I think, says something about both of these women and their commitment to one another and who they are themselves. Sandra Butler, on my far right, is the author of several books, the first of which is The Conspiracy of Silence, The Trauma of Incest, written in 1978. This was the first book ever written about sexual abuse of young women and girls in the country, and Sandra became a very important speaker around the country on issues of violence against women for many, many decades. She is also the author of Cancer and Two Voices, written with Barbara Rosenblum, her partner at the time, who passed in 1988. And she is also co-producer of 2 documentary films, one about Cancer and Two Voices, and the second, Ruthie and Connie, Every Room in the House, in 2004. Okay. Sandy has facilitated workshops for community activists, for social workers, psychologists, on political, economic, cultural, and psychological dimensions of violence against women and on women's issues internationally and nationally. Nan Fink-Geffen has published 3 books: Stranger in the Mist in 1997, a book about her conversion to Judaism, Discovering Jewish Meditation in 1999, a book about Jewish meditation in which basically Nan was one of the first to introduce the subject of meditation in a Jewish context, and a third book, Clear Lake, a novel. So for both of these women, writing is something that they have been doing for decades. I think the collaboration was an experiment, as I said, that succeeded, I'm glad to say. Nan Geffen has worked as a psychotherapist in private practice, and she's the founding publisher. I hope that's not me getting. Nan is the founding publisher of Tikkun magazine, and she remains on the advisory board. She's the co-founder of a Center for Jewish Meditation in Berkeley called Chokhmat HaLev, Wisdom of the Heart. And she is the founding editor and publisher of something that is very dear to my heart, Persymmetry, which is an online magazine of arts and culture by women over 60 for everyone. I've been involved in that with Nan from the very beginning, as was Sandy as well. Both of these women are able to, because of their past experience and the breadth of their concerns and their involvement in women's issues, they are able to conceptualize the larger context of mothering adult daughters, so that the book contains observations about culture, history, and family. And most importantly, they are both themselves mothers of middle-aged daughters, so they have been able to draw on their own experience in conceptualizing and bringing this book to life. So I present to you with great pleasure and with pride in my very dear friends. Sandra Butler will begin, and Nan will
follow. Thank you.
Hello to all the mothers, a few fathers, all the daughters. Thank you all for being here today. When Nan and I were writing the book, one of the conversations that we kept circling around was, what were we going to call this book? And the decision that we made to call it "It Never Ends," the laughter of recognition always happens. It never ends, is to challenge the assumption that at this time in our lives, we're no longer mothering. We know that we're mothering. It feels different, it is different, but it's still mothering, and we wanted to try to understand the contours of what mothering is for us now, what it feels like, what our experiences is, and how, as we are aging, and our daughters are aging, and we are coming to the conclusion of our life, and our daughters are in the middle of full and active and busy forward-looking lives, how that asymmetry plays out in the relationship that we have in the here and now. When we were talking about this, we began to look and see what other books spoke to these questions and these concerns. And with the exception of the poets and the writers who are always, the poets and the novelists, who are always ahead of the social scientists, we didn't really find very much. So we did something that a lot of second-wave feminists do in the most automatic way. We wrote what we needed to read. We created what didn't exist because we needed to have it. So the questions that we developed in the 78 interviews that we did were our questions. The questionnaire was the easiest part of the process for us because we knew what we wanted to ask and we knew what we wanted to hear from other women. The intention that we had was to open a conversation. This book is an exploratory book. We have no conclusions. We have no suggestions. This is a glimpse into what sense and what patterns we've made out of the 78 women we interviewed, out of our own life experience and those of our close friends. It was important to both of us that the women we spoke with be the subject of their own experience, not be someone to be studied, not be someone to be improved, but to be able to speak in their own words. Of course, the first question that we got in every interview was, this is going to be anonymous, right? But once mothers understood there was complete anonymity and respect, there were so many stories and feelings just lodged in their throat that they wanted to tell and they wanted to say in their own words, in their own voices. So that's what this book is. There are no very big extrapolations beyond that. The other intention that Nan and I had was to challenge the ageist and the sexist psychological theories that surround motherhood, even when we were young mothers, and continue with the folding in of ageist thinking about women. We wanted to push against some of those psychological theories and hear a little bit more directly and clearly what the lived experience of mothers are. We interviewed 78 women, and we did our very best to have as broad a cross-section as we could across race, sexual orientation, class, geography, education, work. We tried to get as full a range of perspectives and pointed sexualities. I mean, it was a pretty wide-ranging set of 78 women. So I think that gives you a little bit of an overview of what we did, and as Marcia said, collaboration is a putting a friendship into the fire. And it is really part of the gift for me, is not only having this book, not only having these conversations, but the deepening of the relationship that I have with one of my oldest friends in the process of doing this book. So, with that, Nan is going to speak a little bit about some of the things that we unearthed in our interviews.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Marcia, dear friends. And how wonderful to be here. We've been looking forward to it so much. There's familiar faces. I can't say I know your names, all of you, necessarily, but some dear friends are here, family, what a pleasure, and some people who I've seen through the years at Ashby events, Ashby Village events. So, thank you. Thank you for having us here. When Sandy and I started to interview women for this book, the question that we had at the top of our list was, we'd say to them, so could you describe your relationship with your daughter? It's kind of the obvious question, right? Well, almost always women would say, we're really close, or we're not very close, or we're really distant, or we're sort of close, but not completely. In other words, there was a continuum from close to distance that women were thinking about themselves in relationship to their daughters. And it's a kind of obvious, easy way to talk about their experience as mothers. But also we started to think a little bit more in depth about why would women say this? A lot of other things they could say. And in thinking about that, we plugged more and more into the yearning women have to be close, this continuum that they're looking at. They would rather be on the close side than the distant side. And all the way through in our conversations, this was such a theme of yearning for connection and closeness with daughters. Now, about half the women we spoke to were pretty close or were really close side. And the other half weren't. They were, I wish we were closer, but we don't have much in common that we can talk about. We're not very close. There's estrangement. And so I say this because a lot of times when we start talking about this, people don't necessarily understand that our experience was one of hearing stories about women who had a lot of pain in their relationships with their daughters. Things were not working, and they were disappointed and sorrowful about that. Also, there is a fact that closeness and distance is variable over time. I'm sure some of you have had the experience of periods when you were really close to your daughter, or we can enlarge that and say your son too, your children, but then you weren't so close. I remember talking with a woman who was just in tears because she and her daughter used to be really close. They would see each other really often, so many times a week, but then her daughter drifted away quite well. It was more abrupt than drifting. She left the relationship. And the mother said, this is the most sorrowful thing I've ever experienced in my life. So we heard a lot about this in our conversations. But what is closeness? One woman's closeness is not the other woman's closeness. There were women we spoke to who, one woman said, every day I get up and go running, and then I drop by my daughter's house. And because she has children at home, she's not working at this point, so we sit and we just have a conversation. It's like morning coffee, my daughter. And other women say, I hardly ever talk to my daughter. I hardly ever see her. And for some women, this is fine. They feel close to their daughters if there's not all that much contact. But other women, for them, closeness is daily contact or some form thereof. So we have this whole kind of spread of what it is to be close. I think probably the thing that we heard about the most when we're talking about closeness, and we say, well, what do you mean that you're pretty close? The main thing that we heard about was how much contact they have. Contact's a really big thing for women, for mothers. So contact was in a variety of forms. We could, no surprise here, it's visits, it's seeing each other, it's going sometimes on vacations with. It's phone calls, it's emails, it's texting, blah, 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 all that stuff, doing things together. And one interesting thing we found is that women they tracked themselves pretty carefully. Like, oh, okay, so I see my daughter, every 2 months. And their kind of opinion about whether that was a good thing or not had a lot to do with where they came from in their families. Because there were some women we spoke to who came from families where there was just a lot of contact between those two generations. And so one woman said, it just breaks my heart. My daughter lives, 5-10 minutes away, and I just kind of wait for her to call. I wait to see her. It's very sad. And the more we talked, we heard about how she and her mother used to go shopping together. They used to be, have daily contact, and this was just a horrible thing. She just couldn't understand. So in her mind, they were really distant. We spoke with a woman who came to the U.S. from another country when she was young. And this was back in the days when you couldn't just pick up the phone and call. There was no email and no Skyping and all the wonderful things that we do now. And she had the experience of having her own daughter here in the U.S. Now, the daughter lives in Florida, I think. She lives here in the Bay Area. And so the mother says, we're so close. I only see her once a year. That's all we can manage to get together. We don't really talk that much on the phone, but she feels that they're very close because her own experience with her own mother was they were oceans apart. So this is something that she feels good about, she feels proud about it. We found that amongst women there was a lot of pride when they felt that they were close to their daughters. And for some women, there was some kind of shame when there wasn't that closeness. Now, a lot of times, when women were close with their daughters, there were lots of kind of good reasons why that wasn't working so well. A lot of times it would be personalities. It was just not a good fit between their personalities in some way. Or they had such different values or whatever. There were reasons why they felt this wasn't working out so well. But still, it's like, oh, we should be close. Mothers and daughters should be close. That's how it is set out to be. And if you don't do that, there's some kind of failing. Of course, we know there isn't, but that's what is internalized, this sense of shame and failure that some women carry. So closeness is a really huge thing that women talk about, and that's how they frame their relationships, the name they give to it, or many women do. That's the first thing, that actually surprised us. When we went into this, we didn't know what we were going to find. We just knew the little circle of people around ourselves, and it's not like we talked about mothering with people that much. I actually think women don't talk about mothering that much with each other. And that's one of the reasons we wrote the book. But this was so obvious when we were interviewing women. That's the first thing. The second thing that really blew us away was the number of women who, without us asking a leading question, said spontaneously, I don't really feel that I can talk fully and openly and honestly with my daughter. The more that we looked into this, the clearer it was that women have a great need and desire to be known in their relationships with their daughter. To be known not only as mom or grandma, but as woman who has had a life separate from that relationship and has feelings about various issues and things that have occurred. And so, and I can tell you this, big surprise, women who say they're close to their daughters also say they feel like they don't quite have their voice sometimes with their daughters. This is not all the time, but so you would think, well, women who are close, oh, right, they would be able to say anything. And they would feel they're known by their daughters, but that isn't the case. We heard all kinds of little things like, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells with my daughter. And I don't know whether some of you can relate to that. Like, I don't know what, it seems like I can set her off. And I need to be careful, all of this. And, you know, it's a paradox, I think, because women in our generation have spent a lot of time finding our voices as younger women, having grown up in the years we did when we were, in some ways, trained not to be fully present. We were trained to be supporters and caretakers and so forth. That's a little overdrawn, but still, for many of us, to find our voices out in the world, to advocate for things we believe, to really, and in our families, to find our way as a full person has meant something to us. It's been something that some of us feel kind of proud of accomplishing it, probably especially in the workplace. And so here's this daughter who you love. You know, your heart is right there. You love this person. And yet, there are things that you feel you can't quite say. You wish you could, but you can't. Or if you do, the relationship maybe will go to a bad place. And what we found as women talked about this, there's a huge desire. At this point in life, we know our lives are not going to go on forever. We know that we are, well, we're all going to be leaving this earth at some point in the relatively, like not decades away probably, maybe some of us decades away. But still, we have a different sense of time than our middle-aged children or daughters have. And so there's and also our lives are constructed differently in a way where we're most likely, many of us are not in the height of trying to reach professional accomplishment. We're more in the withdrawing, and we'll talk more about this later, thinking about what's really important. And so we have almost different wants and needs. So I just want to point out, if you feel this way in your relationship, you're not at all alone. That it's so common for women to feel this. So I need to find my transition to Sandy here. Okay. So these are two of the larger patterns that emerged in our investigation. And Sandy is going to speak about what mothering is like in the day-to-day life.
Okay, so mothering in the present tense. There's two parts of that I want to talk about. The first one is kind of a description of what we heard constitutes mothering in the present tense. The first one is a word that came up over and over again, and that was accompanying. Accompanying my daughter. Being there when she needs me. And the other one was taking care of business. So let me start by talking a little bit about the kinds of words that we heard when women talked about accompaniment. These are quotes from the interviews. I'm guiding her, but with a light touch. My pressure is strong still, just not so active. Mothers serve as a sounding board, as emotional support, being better able to see things from the daughter's point of view, hopefully. Maintaining family ties is another one of the ways that we're mothering. We're the ones who typically make sure Thanksgiving happens, that everybody gets to the right city at the right time, or the family rituals occur as they occur in the family. There are mothers that we spoke with who were involved in what we called intensive mothering, which describes a daughter who would either have a mental or physical situation needing mother to step out of her life and mother in a more active or full-time way. And we interviewed some women who had daughters with physical and mental disabilities where the mothering was active and ongoing throughout their whole lives. So that was very much part of what we heard, and those are things that we refer to. But in the most part, it's a kind of skillful accompaniment. And to add to what Nan was saying, it's a way of knowing when to speak, how to speak, what words are best to use, so as to keep the stasis that you have, whatever it is, whatever degree of close you have. You don't risk it and you don't jeopardize it in any way. We do it without thinking. And as we get older, we get better and better at it. But there's a price. And there's melancholy that goes with that. The second part of the mothering on a daily kind of basis is the taking care of business. And this is taking care of what falls through the cracks. Now, not all of the mothers that we interviewed were geographically accessible to one another. Sometimes mothers had to fly for a week and I quote, fill up the freezer. Yeah? So we take care of business in whatever ways we can. Pick up the grandchildren from school, take a turn on the carpool. If we have access to money and money is needed, we give money as gifts, as loans, in whatever way works for us. When we asked women, what is your daily experience of mothering now? One woman said, and this is the place of the melancholy that sort of ran a little bit through a through line through a lot of these interviews, I leave my life at the door when I walk into my daughter's house. So there's nods, so you know what that feels like. Another woman said, I'm the one in charge of making the relationship work. They assume this is the ground they're walking on. My job is to be sure the ground is smooth and there are no boulders. My job is to keep things running smoothly. She expects me to be there when she needs me, but to butt out at the same time. This is a thin needle to thread that we're threading all the time. I'm mothering lighter than I used to. I'm still there in all ways, just lighter. But as Faulkner reminded us, the past is not past, it's not dead, and it's not past. It's still very much with us. So to just step back a little bit to remember that the women of our generation were women who came of whatever degree of consciousness in the 60s and the 70s when everything changed. Everything about what it meant to be a woman, everything about everything. 50% of marriages between the mid-60s and the mid-70s ended in divorce. And we were raised, for the most part, in a kind of conventional family situation, many of us, where our mothers were not expecting or assuming they would be known by us or seen by us in the way that we do. Our mothers mothered. They prepared us for the world in the very best way they could. So I think that it's important to hold the generational perspective as we come to the parts of the relationship with mothers and daughters that don't work. Because we're bringing a kind of yearning for closeness, for intimacy. The whole vocabulary of intimacy was something that emerged in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, think about our mothers saying to us, well, how do you feel? When in fact, it's a very ordinary, natural thing for us to say, or want to say, or hope to say to our daughters. Now, I'm speaking in very broad brush here, and of course there are many, many exceptions, but culturally the pattern seems to shape this way. So we know that the past is always alive in our relationships, and that with our daughters, they're littered still with a kind of third whales and unhealed wounds that don't get said out loud, but everybody knows they're there. And one of the ones that Nan and I found that was pretty consistent was the fallout from the divorces. Even though it's 40 years later, Mom left Dad to go to work for another man, for another woman, because she wanted to go to political meetings for whatever reason. The disruption of the family is something that caused an enormous amount of pain to our daughters, pain that we could not have anticipated, because of course what we were doing was modeling a new way to be a woman. We were going to be involved in the home, we were going to be involved in the world, they were going to see what freedom looked like, but it didn't actually work that way. Because as it turns out, young people are very conservative. They want Wednesday to be like Thursday. All the spontaneity, all the adventures backfired in many, many of the lives of the women that we interviewed. So there are lots of ways that mothers and daughters navigate difficulties, and there are lots of categories. I'm just in the best interest of time and in our actual fundamental desire to hear your questions. I'm just going to talk about two: anger and advice. And a lot of times we found that the anger from the daughters emerged from that long-standing, unarticulated, unresolved, whatever, feeling about the way mother has lived her life. It's still alive in the relationship, even though it hasn't been said. One woman said it's like dancing around our history. We had some fairly dramatic situations. I don't know if they're common or they were just dramatic in our 78, but situations where divorces were really toxic and fathers said terrible things about the mothers to the daughters, and daughters were left having to try to line up somewhere and getting caught in triangles and all of that, that remains alive in the relationship with the mother. Even if other parts of the relationship are really going well and smoothly, it's a third rail. And so what we found that mothers do around those kinds of third rails is diffuse, deflect, and distract. Is to just sort of find a way to maneuver around it so that it doesn't explode. And it's back to what Nan was saying, which is risking the closeness, whatever the shape of the closeness, is the most dangerous thing of all. So all of the efforts are to maintain what you have. Now there is something to be said from the point of view of the daughters, and that is the anger that they feel when advice is given unwittingly embedded in judgment. So many laughters of recognition here. So that's sort of upon us to be sure we're not couching judgment in some well-intended advice, because that's guaranteed to backfire. I think all of us have lived it enough times to know that for sure. So some words now that are not mine of the women we interviewed. I do a very careful dance around advice, knowing I can injure her more than most people. If I ask something, she'll pull away. I'm not to probe, but to wait. And that suggests another piece of the complexity of all of this, and that has to do with the temperament of our daughters. Some daughters are more private, and they were from the time they were little. And if you went after them with questions about how was school when they were 8, you would get the same response that you get when she's 48. She comes forth when she comes forth. And there are other daughters who are more open and forthcoming and willing to communicate, and that's a different set of problems, because it's easy to get caught with that thinking that everything is okay to say until you hit the thing that's not. Another kind of poignant thing that we found had to do with mothers offering advice, although they called it guidance. And it had to do with mothers and daughters where the daughter was moving what they call class travel. The daughter was moving up into a world that the mother did not inhabit and was not knowledgeable about or comfortable with. And the mother was feeling left out and left behind. It's kind of the way it's usually said is, don't forget your common sense, which is another way of saying, don't forget me. Don't forget I have something to bring to you and to bring to your life. And then one mother said, she's the one with the power now. I'm available when she seeks me out, but I'm careful not to pursue. So there are so many facets of how we relate, what the temperament is, what our temperament is, what hers is, what our history is, how comfortable we are with the shape of the closeness that we have. As Nan and I went through this series of interviews, it just kept getting more and more subtle and more complex, which is why it's so exciting, the kind of response that we've gotten just in the 3 months that the book has been in the world. There are so many stories and so many more layers and so much more complexity that we'll begin to round this out. So with that, let me turn you back to Nan.
Oh my, we can really talk. And we're just going this deep into all that we have to say. One thing we discovered is that many women at this time in their lives are going through what we ended up calling a period of reckoning. Sounds rather severe, don't mean for it to be severe. But it is that at this time of the life, the questions that we have for ourselves are not questions about, you know, what work do I want to do in my life? Or do I want to have children in the future? Or all the questions of younger women. Our questions are different. Our questions are more, what has my life been? And at the core of that question is, what have these relationships been, these important relationships been? And so, at the top of that list, for many, many women, is their relationships with their daughters. We spoke with women who, they would say without a doubt, their daughter is the most important in the world to them, most important person. Other women are embedded in larger families and have more relationships, but their daughter is still there at the top of important connections in their lives. So still, when women are at this point begin to think about, how have I been as a mother? That can be a very sobering time, because I have a sense that as we get older, we get to be more honest with ourselves. We can see where we went off the mark. We can see, perhaps less defensively, where we caused damage. We can also see, I think, many would say, we can see that it can't be excused away. It's still alive, as Sandy said, in our relationships and in our daughters, and we see it. And so there we are, looking, thinking, and it's so interesting to us, because over the course of these relationships, we saw women who were just at the very beginning of this stage, like, you know, it just hit me that, God, I really was hurtful to my daughter when I did X or Y. Or women who even are saying, like, I can see even now how I get caught up in power struggles with my daughter. Never occurred to me before. We've been doing it all these years. But there I am. I can see how I'm caught up in that power struggle. And so the vision turns inward a bit. And so what we saw is that there were great possibilities with this for really reflecting and sometimes making amends with daughters, reflecting and thinking about how it could be different. And some women talked about how, you know, I really understood for the first time how I had preferred one daughter over the other in a way, and the daughter who was not preferred was really still in pain about that, and I really made an effort, and I spoke to her about this and so forth. So we see some women who acknowledge and take responsibility for what is awry in these relationships, and do something, actively about that. And many women who don't. We talked with women who was like, this is such a sorrow in my life, it'll always be this way. I did this, my daughter has removed herself from me, and there's nothing that can be done. And so that's almost another extreme. And those of us who are more in the middle, we're left with these feelings of, I wasn't the mother that I wanted to be somehow or another, and that's a difficult thing to deal with. So, again, over time, it seems that many women work their way through this, And they work their way through this, some of them, by coming to accept who they are and who they were, and accept who their daughters are. That's a very big deal for a lot of women. A lot of women are still looking at their daughters and thinking, you know, why doesn't she clean up her house better, you know? Or why is she so helicopter parenting her children, you know? And so those kinds of judgments, we know women who have worked with that and have let those go in some way, or started to let those go. Some women have gotten to the point where they apologize directly to their children, their daughters, and have conversations that are, we'll use the word healing. And it's a wonderful thing. It's a kind of a new opening in the relationship at a time when nobody really expected it. So there is that. There is acknowledgement of mistakes. There is apologies. There's forgiveness of self and forgiveness of daughter. Yeah. That little tickle. And so this is all part of that time of reckoning. And we know that so many mothers come to a deeper appreciation of their daughters as they grow older. A lot of the stuff is kind of sifted out. Mothers know that they don't have to say everything to their daughters. They can just appreciate and enjoy and love their daughters. So that's where some women end up. It's a very difficult thing if you're quite alienated from your daughter to make your peace with that, but some women do. In a way, kind of bless their daughters as they go out doing their lives separate from them, which is a hard thing to do to get to that point. But we heard stories of that. So, in conclusion, I do want to say that for mothers at this point, it's not necessarily a nice, smooth, sweet ride resting in the love we have for our daughters and the love our daughters have for us. And yet, there it is. And we found that it was really important for women to talk about it because these things aren't spoken very much. And we think, Sandy and I, that it would be a really good thing if women talked more about their experiences of mothering at this time.